Let's keep talking about categories. Remember how we all used to see water turning into ice as kids? How did you even think of saying that? It's simple, I saw it happen. One winter, I left a bowl of water in the yard. It was water at first, but after a while, it froze into ice. I saw it with my own eyes, so I said water turned into ice. Wait a second, you saw the liquid form and named it water, then later you saw it in the solid form and called it ice. No doubt, without your senses working, these two states wouldn't even be recognized. First, there was the liquid perception, then came the solid perception. But why link the two together? What word do you use? Turn into. Where does this verb come from? It comes from the description of observations of external objects. Your eyes, your senses, have never reported to you that the thing later called ice and the thing previously called water are the same thing. Did your senses ever report this to you? No. If you tell me that the previous water turned into the later ice, would ask, how do you know? You reply, I have been squatting by this basin and never left. No one secretly poured out the previous water or put in the later ice. I stayed right here, so I saw the water freeze into ice. Now, I am about to criticize you. How do I criticize you? I say, why don't you consider another perspective? Why don't you see the thing previously called water as going from being to non-being, and the thing later called ice as coming into existence out of nothingness? Who is stopping you from thinking this way? Have your senses ever prevented you from thinking in this manner? Do you all agree with this point? This is a mental exercise, a thought experiment. When we delve into Western philosophy, it really gets our brains working and sharpens our logical thinking just like math does. The idea that water turns into ice isn't based on experience but on something inherent. What could that be? You strongly hold the belief that nothing can disappear entirely into nothingness or magically come into existence out of thin air. It's what you truly believe in. So, when water transforms into ice and you say it's freezing, you're not just observing it happen. Instead, you're subconsciously slotting it into your understanding, bridging the gap between how you perceive liquid and solid states. This word, freezing, that you use is more than just a term. It's a bigger idea, with entity as its foundation, revealing yet another category. When we talk about entity, which in English is substance, we decided to translate it as entity. Why pick these two words? Well, in Chinese, we rely a lot on what we can feel. When you first lay eyes on the characters for entity in Chinese, they look solid, impenetrable, seamless. Also, you'll notice they take up space. But calling it an entity is not entirely accurate because it's more of a category that doesn't have any physical properties. Still, we had to find a translation for substance, so we chose two words from Chinese. One is shi, and the other is ti. In reality, an entity doesn't have any physical properties, it's more about expressing a concept. Substance is what maintains its consistency while everything changes. Substance is all about keeping that consistency through change, and that's why it's considered a category. Earlier we talked about existence and now we're delving into entity. Let's dig a bit deeper. Think about when water freezes into ice, you've got two parts to this experience. First, you've got what you perceive with your senses, the liquid and solid states, that's the sensory part. Then, there's the entity part, which comes from your thoughts, not your senses. These two parts mix together to create the experience of water turning into ice. This pattern repeats for every experience. Without it, we just have senses, not experiences. In Western philosophy, they make a clear distinction. What you sense isn't the same as what you experience. Experiences are like the glue that sticks all those sensory bits together, and that glue is the entity category, just a way to make it easier to understand. So, who's the one linking two experiences together? Here, it's the entity category. So, let's be real, the law of conservation of matter wasn't discovered by Romonosov. In the world of chemistry, Romonosov was the one who figured out that neat trick. Take combustion, for instance. When something burns, it might seem like it's vanishing into thin air. But if you seal it up and let it burn completely, the amount might shrink, but the weight stays the same. That's how he landed on the idea of the conservation of matter in chemistry. And you know, this concept is kind of built into us humans. It's like a little something in our minds that we all carry around, a way of understanding the world. We don't think stuff pops out of nowhere or disappears into nothingness. It's more about things changing from one form to another, keeping their essence, their entity. It's a bit like a mental tool we use to link up different ways we sense things and make them into experiences. Experience isn't just something that pops up out of the blue, it's something we put together based on what our senses tell us. When we perceive things, what we really get are little snapshots of how things appear to us. It's like putting together a puzzle. Each piece of perception forms part of the bigger picture we call experience. In English, we call this experience, and in Chinese it's known as Jing Wei with grave N. This whole process of piecing it all together is something we all do in a similar way, because our ways of thinking are pretty much the same. When we start to think about things, we enter a world that we all share, where individual preferences and desires take a back seat, unless, of course, you decide not to think at all. Based on how we feel personally, we can't fully explain everything in this world. Here's a simple example. Imagine the tap is on and you're ready to shower. Mr. Zhang goes first and thinks the water is scalding hot. Later, Mr. Li goes in and complains that it's freezing cold. So, who's right? Is there a right or wrong answer here? Not really. So, what's the solution? It's pretty straightforward, just use a category to set aside their different feelings. And what's that category? Temperature. This means we don't have to argue about whether the water is too hot or too cold, just check the current temperature. If it's at 36 degrees, that's good enough. Feeling hot or cold is personal, but in the objective world, we have water at a specific temperature like 36 degrees. With this category in place, we establish a common understanding, and categories start to make sense. Degree is another category we know about. When we learned about dialectics, we categorize quality and quantity. So, when quantity changes, it can lead to a change in quality. Why does this happen? Well, when the quantity hits a certain level, a qualitative change takes place. And now, we've got all three categories, quantity, degree, and quality, all of them falling under categories. But where do these categories come from? Do they come from our senses discovering things? Nope, they come from how we sort and understand things, within each person's ability to grasp them. So, if you dive into how we naturally understand things, just like Western philosophy does, it delves into the fundamental way we think, and then looks at how our experiences come about. Every experience is shaped this way. When we talk about experiences with nature, they're called natural experiences, like how water turns into ice. And when it comes to experiences in our social lives, those are known as social experiences, and are crafted in a similar way. I've shared this funny story with some of my buddies before. Back when I was living in number 10 dormitory at Fudan University, I had this neighbor who happened to be a sociology professor. We hit it off because we both enjoyed sipping on some yellow wine. We would often hang out and have a few drinks together. One time, he came over to my place and we started knocking back the yellow wine. As the alcohol kicked in, he got a little loose-lipped. He goes, "You philosophers are a bit ridiculous, you know." I was like, "Oh really, how so?" He went on, "You philosophers attempt to analyze social reality issues just like us sociologists do. I've read some of your articles, and there's a noticeable difference between sociology and philosophy writings." I ask him, "What's the difference then?" And he goes, "Your philosophical discussions are all about fancy theories that don't really have any practical value." Feeling a bit tipsy myself, I decided to shoot back. Sociology is considered a super cool science, unlike the airy-fairy stuff we delve into in philosophy. So, tell me, what does sociology actually study? He answers, "Social facts." I then throw another question his way, "How do you figure out these social facts?" He confidently says, "Through observation." I couldn't help it and burst into laughter, a kind of mysterious chuckle. "What's so funny?" he asks. I reply, "You can't just observe social facts. They're not something you can see with your eyes." And he was totally puzzled by my response. I was like, "Let me give you a simple example. Picture this, on a certain date and time, two groups of people are throwing down in Shanghai's Nanjing West Road, and a news reporter just happens to stroll by. So, how should they tell the story of this out-of-the-blue event? What's the best way to report it? They could spin it as some mobsters having a turf war, a showdown between cops and robbers, or an uprising by the people. But, hey, they gotta pick one angle, right? Now, did the reporter actually witness a cop versus robber battle? Can they see a gang rumble going down in the criminal world? Can they spot a full-on uprising by the people? Nope, no way. So, if the reporter wants to keep it real and report what they actually saw, they should just say, at a certain date and time in Shanghai's Nanjing West Road, two groups of highly evolved primates were duking it out. That's the real deal, just stating what they saw. He described a physical event, right? But if he wants to talk about real society stuff, there's a catch. What's that catch? Concepts. He's gotta have some concepts in his head. If he has the idea of a country, that's when he'll actually see the showdown between cops and robbers. So, what's this country idea all about? It's basically legit public force. And what's a robber? It's like your shady private force. And what's up with a fight between cops and bandits? It's the clash between legit public force and shady private force, and that's the real deal in society. Now, does this social showdown need something specific, like legit public force? Yup, that's the must-have, and it's all part of this concept called the country. The country is all about legit public force, and he's gotta have this country concept in mind if he wants to uncover what's really going on in the cops versus robbers battle. This morning class kicked off by talking about Pythagorean numbers and how they viewed the universe, then dives into figuring out categories. It's all about getting to the bottom of Western thinking. They're saying that what is real doesn't just depend on how we see things. It's all about this idea called logos, like what Heraclitus believed in. By looking at how we talk about stuff, we can actually know for sure that the world is a thing that exists outside of just what we can touch and see. Previously, their idea was pretty straightforward: this world was made up of stuff they can touch and feel. Actually, the way we see the world is shaped by how we think. Take the phrase, "This is the Yellow River," for example. The key word here is, which shows that something exists. It's all about the way we perceive things. So, when we say something exists, like when we call a river the Yellow River, it doesn't matter how it flows or changes. If we follow the river back to its origins, it's just a forest, a small stream, not really the Yellow River at all. So, basically, our human way of thinking is revealed through language, and the way we put our sentences together reflects how our minds work. Earlier today, we talked about how every experience is put together rather than just handed to us, and what we actually perceive with our senses are just various sensations and images, not necessarily true experiences. These sensory perceptions are all over the place, making our world seem chaotic rather than orderly. But thanks to our ability to organize thoughts, we manage to turn these perceptions into meaningful experiences. We used an example, like when water freezes and becomes ice. This everyday experience wouldn't make sense without the idea of a substance. It's like, our brains kinda make up this whole concept of substance. It's not like our eyes tell us about it. Our senses can't really explain that kinda stuff. The stuff that was water before and is ice now, that it's all the same thing really. Our senses don't tell us that. It's more like how we humans construct our experiences. So, to make sense of two different perceptions becoming one experience, using a category called substance. Westerners believe that when you're thinking, you're in a real world. What does that even mean? They're talking about discovering thinking itself. It may sound weird, aren't we always in our heads anyway? Why does it need to be called a discovery? But in the history of Western thinking, this was a pretty big deal. They started separating their thinking from regular psychological stuff. We have feelings, emotions, desires, and will, which are all part of our psyche, and we usually see our thoughts as personal mind activities. We do the thinking, and well, obviously, it's us humans who do it, right? So, they see thinking as mixed up with all the other stuff our minds do. Basically, they didn't previously separate thinking out from everything else. While they were feeling things, liking or disliking stuff, wanting things, they were also making distinctions, like Buddhism talks about, but in the West, Parmenides was the first to identify a specific type of thinking called existence, and that was a big deal. He identified the idea of pure thought itself, just plain old thinking.